Thank you, Dr. Beisner, and thank you for pitching in. I think you did an incredibly fabulous job, really. Okay, so, yes. So all our panelists, thank you so much. Now, the question and answer period, we do have some time for some questions and answers. Questions would be good, as opposed to answers from the audience. Please identify yourself and identify the panelist or panelists whom you'd prefer to have answer your question, and then give us your speech question. John Noder, the Government Relations Director of the Heartland Institute, will be going around with a microphone to give you the opportunity to ask your questions. Let's begin.
Dr. Beisner, my name is George Mears, Suffolk, Virginia. I'm an environmental
Hi, George.
engineer. I'm an environmental engineer.
Right.
What you're saying makes so much sense, but it is exactly what the politicians seem totally unable to articulate. What kind of outreach do you have to, municipal, public, state, federal? Secretary of Energy could use this information, and he's totally incapable. You listen to his Senate confirmation; he's totally unable to articulate it or unwilling to do so. I think they don't know.
Well, I think I had an unfair advantage here, and that is that I had just minutes' notice that I was going to have to do this, which meant that I had to speak simply. The great temptation is for us to obfuscate a lot, and especially those who are in political positions tend to want to do that, because that way you can't pin them down as to exactly what they think. But your question actually was, what is our outreach to people like that? Well, we publish a newsletter, an electronic newsletter that comes out a couple of times a week. It's always educational, and I confess we also do ask for support. We're a nonprofit, and I do mean non-profit, so we need that. But we publish that. We have a website that is loaded with good educational articles and major studies that have been done. And our 65-some scholars are available to consult with people. I mean, we can provide folks to testify as expert witnesses. We've done it. Quite a number of our people have testified before congressional committees and the like. And we can do that for state legislators and for county and municipal bodies as well. So those are some of the things we do, and I'm happy. We also provide speakers as Sam mentioned when he introduced me. We speak at churches, conferences, universities, seminaries, colleges all over the country. So we're glad to do that stuff.
Julian Morris from Reason Foundation. I enjoyed all of your talks. Question, I guess mainly for Randy, but you may all have comments. You spoke about the perverse incentives that politicians face to do something. Is there something, or more than one thing, that politicians could do that would actually enable more effective protection of the environment, while at the same time improving economic situation for people? So in other words, a lot of the concerns that people have here are that stupid things are being done that are harmful for the environment and harmful for people, but is there a way of motivating politicians to do things that are less stupid and perhaps even beneficial?
Julian, just keep doing the kinds of things you're doing. It's a one politician at a time project, and giving them something that they can use so that when people challenge them, that they can have some backbone about it. Look at Scott Pruitt's statement about climate change last week. The press thought he was awful. There were scientists who wrote long op-eds, and I'm from Utah. The Salt Lake City, we have two daily papers. One's the Salt Lake Tribune, and the Tribune had this long piece by two professors from the University of Utah saying how terrible Scott Pruitt was. All he said was, we can't measure it. We don't know. And so I'm not willing to say humans are the major cause. his statement is absolutely correct, but the climate change, I was trying to look for a good word to not use juggernaut. It is a really people are really well organized, and they mean, most of them mean well. They think they've got God on their side, and so we have to give them another way of saying, but God's on our side too. And I think standing up for people when they say something like Pruitt did, I probably write a piece, a response in the Salt Lake Tribune. It won't have any effect on anybody who really matters, other than maybe some of my politician friends will say, hey, let's be willing to have a little more backbone. But it really, I think it is generally a one politician at a time approach.
Yes, Steve Hines. How do we introduce the importance of economic development into the sort of media narrative right now?
Wow.
Do you have a particular one of us in mind?
Well, he's an economist, I pretend to be, and he's a historian.
Right.
Well, I mean, it's certainly, the economy and jobs and is an important, is an important theme in the media. It's certainly an important theme in political campaigns as well. I mean, I think, if anything, what you need to do is move more toward educating people that government doesn't really have a role to play in leading that economic development. That what they need to do is stand out of the way and allow markets to work for economic development. And I think there's a good deal of truth for that for environmental protection too. Allow entrepreneurship and markets and to work both for economic development and environmental protection.
I can add a little bit on that because I'm also a journalist. I was a newspaper reporter, editor, and publisher for a number of years. My dad was a journalist all his life. So I know something of the profession. There are two, I think, particular obstacles. One is that the Society of Environmental Journalists, clear back in, I believe it was 1986, actually voted at its annual meeting officially that it would not be neutral on environmental issues, that it would not seek to tell even-handedly all sides of those issues. It became explicitly an advocacy organization. That makes a really difficult thing for us to deal with. And so part of what I've found has been important is to get around the specifically environmental journalists and go to journalists in other interests and show them how the environmental and the developmental questions impact on their own interests as journalists and get them to start telling the story. So that's a part of it. And then the other part of it is just simply for us to have, I think, a lot of patience. After years as a reporter and having to cover 20 different issues in a single week after week, reporters do not have the time to become deeply informed on any issue. And so that's why, I mean, when I meet reporters who want to interview me on climate change issues, even on the science, and I've read voluminously on that, over 50 books on the science of climate change and thousands of articles on it. I try to start them out as simply as I can. I just kind of inform them. I ask them questions so that as I interview them, they discover the depths of their own superficiality, if I can use the oxymoron, depths of superficiality. And that then helps them to realize maybe I need to learn a little bit more here before I start writing with such great assurance.
And it's useful to have stories.
Yeah.
Just to be able to say that more people have been lifted out of abject poverty in the last 20 years than in the history of the world.
Yeah. Not just in numbers, but as a percentage of the total population.
Yeah. And that's because of markets and economic development. That's a great lead-in to have the conversation, I believe. But we need reporters like stories, and we need to be able to tell good stories.
Yeah.
I'm Pierre Bouteille, a climate realist from France. You talked of God, you talked of religion. However, I have not heard the word encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis, and I wanted to know if either of you was aware of the De Larmina brothers who are trying to lobby the Vatican City or whoever is in charge of science and spirituality in the Vatican City.
Yeah. I'm not aware of those brothers, but if you would put me in touch, I would love to be in touch with them. I did, I carefully, thoroughly read Laudato Si. There are actually 4 paragraphs in there, count them, 4 paragraphs on climate change. Here's one of the most interesting things about Laudato Si. Through all the rest of the encyclical, there are footnotes all over the place. And you can tell that whoever wrote it was writing about something that he actually had studied. He was able to quote things. I don't assume that Pope Francis wrote it all. Popes don't do that, neither do presidents, right? But what was fascinating is that in those 4 paragraphs, there wasn't a single footnote. There was no indication of any in-depth understanding of the back and forth of the debates over climate science, over the degree of climate sensitivity or anything of that sort. So what we did in our critique of Laudato Si, which is published on our website, it's actually done as an open letter to Pope Francis on climate change, was we just took apart those paragraphs and provided the contrary scientific and contrary economic evidence on those. I think what you have in Pope Francis's Laudato Si is a sincere and honest effort to address an issue about which he knew essentially nothing. And it's a really sad thing. And of course, one thing to remember is that popes speak with authority only on faith and morals, and they even claim infallibility only when speaking ex cathedra, not in encyclicals. Encyclicals are their opinion. They're weighty, but they're not taken as authority for Catholics. So this is an issue that needs further addressing, and it's being done, and I'm glad to hear about them, and please come up to me and put me in touch. I was in Rome, by the way, just shortly before Laudato Si was released, along with others from the Heartland Institute, and we presented a series of papers and whatnot, hoping to influence that, and actually, I have a feeling we probably did. My understanding is that the prior draft of Laudato Si went into much more detail, and much of that got pulled out before the last draft came out.
This will be the last question.
So I find it interesting that both the Chinese communists and the people of India have both decided that climate change is important, but they're not going to really do anything about it. I think all of this is a weird form of white Western guilt. I mean, is there any way that we can get the journalists to see that by the things that they're advocating, they sentence millions in India to death?
Yeah. Well, we could start by quoting Ottmar Edenhofer, the German economist who was a co-chairman of the UN IPCC, who in the lead up to the Cancun Climate Summit said, and I'm paraphrasing here, said, you must not be mistaken. This is not an environmental conference. This is the world's largest economic conference, and it's all about redistributing the world's wealth. We blame the industrialized countries of the West for causing cataclysmic climate change, and then we fine them, we penalize them by forcing them to give $100 billion a year to developing countries and to cut back hugely on their own use of fossil fuels while the developing countries get to continue using them. Now, I'm frankly, because I generally agree that CO2's impact on global average temperature is minuscule, all right? I think it's probably real, that's pretty basic physics, but pretty basic physics also tells you that if you drop a rock and a feather at the same moment, they'll hit the ground at the same time, unless, of course, they're in a vacuum, in air, right? But, you know, I'm sorry, I just suddenly lost track. Why India and China, right. What they realize is their interest is in bringing in the money from the West through all the climate negotiations. Once that collapses, I think all their interest in the climate change issue is going to disappear completely. Because frankly, as President Modi, or Prime Minister Modi of India has put it, development for our people is our #1 priority. And because the risks of poverty far outweigh the risks from anything related to climate. I mean, if you're just tolerably well off, like the bottom quintile in America, you can thrive in any climate from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert, right? But if you're dirt poor, you can't thrive in the greatest tropical paradise, right? Modi gets that. And so he's making it clear, we are not going to reduce our use of coal, we're going to increase our use of coal. We're not going to cut back on our emissions. We're going to increase our use of energy because that energy is absolutely indispensable to lifting our people out of poverty. I think that's the right way to think. So when I hope the whole clamor for a global climate agreement to actually be implemented, not just signed, right, with intentions, right? When that clamor dies down, I think India and China will get totally off the issue because there will not be anything as a reward for them.
Thank you for your questions. I think as our panelists have made clear, environmental issues are economic issues. If we're going to reset climate policy, economics has to be central to that process. I want to let you know that the next panel will be at 10:45. We'll have fossil fuels and human prosperity in this ballroom, and cost-benefit analysis and the social cost of carbon in ballroom C through E. I want to thank our panelists, and I hope you will join me as well.